Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Laura Manhattan's most fiercely guarded culinary fortress, blurring the vibrant, neon-lit chaos of the New York streets outside. Inside, the atmosphere was a masterclass in curated perfection. The lighting was low, the jazz was live but unobtrusive, and the air smelled faintly of truffle and aged cedar. It was a place where fortunes were quietly multiplied over rare stakes, and where getting a table required either a 6-month wait or a level of power that transcended reservation books entirely. Alexander Thorne possessed the latter. He sat alone at a corner booth, his back to a solid wall of mahogany, his eyes positioned to command a view of the entire dining room and the front entrance. It was a tactical habit ingrained into his very marrow over a decade of surviving and then conquering the brutal intersection of corporate ruthlessness and the city's unforgiving shadow economy. At 34, Alexander was a man around whom the air seemed to naturally freeze. He was striking in a harsh, unapologetic way. His dark hair was meticulously styled, his jawline sharp as cut glass, and the bespoke charcoal suit he wore draped perfectly over a frame, built for violence but refined for the boardroom. Yet it was his stillness that unsettled people. He didn't fidget. He didn't check his phone. He sat with his hands resting lightly on the white linen tablecloth, the heavy silver of a custom-forged watch catching the dim light. 2 tables away, 3 men in equally immaculate suits ate their dinner in total silence. They were his shadow, his perimeter. Nothing breached Alexander Thorne's space unless he willed it. Tonight, however, the fortress had been breached by a concept he rarely entertained a blind date. It was 20 minutes past 8. The arrangement had been set for 7:30. For a man who counted seconds in millions of dollars, a 50-minute delay was not just an insult. It was an actionable offense. He had only agreed to this absurdity out of respect for Eleanor Vance, the matriarch of a dying aristocratic family who had once, many years ago, offered a young bleeding Alexander a place to hide when the streets had nearly claimed him. Eleanor had called him 3 days ago, her voice trembling with age, but iron in its intent. "She's a good woman, Alex. Not the plastic socialites you terrify. And not the vipers you do business with. Just meet her. 1 hour." He had given it nearly an hour. The glass of Macallan 25 beside his hand remained untouched. He made a silent decision. 5 more minutes. Then the debt to Eleanor would be considered paid in full. He was just shifting his weight, preparing to give the subtle nod to his men to settle the tab, when the heavy oak doors of the restaurant parted. Alexander's gaze tracked the movement instantly. It wasn't the woman he was expecting. In fact, it wasn't a woman at all. Walking through the foyer past a bewildered-looking maitre d' was a child. She appeared to be no older than 6. She wore a bright yellow raincoat that was entirely too cheerful for the somber elegance of Laura, and a small backpack shaped like a silver rocket ship clung to her shoulders. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, and her boots squeaked faintly against the polished marble floor. The dining room collectively held its breath. In a space populated by billionaires, politicians, and socialites, the sudden appearance of an unaccompanied child was as jarring as a gunshot. The maitre d' stepped forward, reaching out a manicured hand. "Little girl, you can't be in here." The child simply bypassed him, her movements possessing a strange, determined dignity. She didn't wander. She didn't look at the glittering chandeliers or the plates of caviar. Her large dark eyes scanned the room with terrifying precision until they landed squarely on the corner booth. On Alexander! His perimeter guards tensed, shifting in their seats, hands casually drifting toward their jackets. A microscopic shake of Alexander's head kept them pinned to their chairs. He watched an unfamiliar flicker of curiosity igniting in his chest as the tiny figure marched directly toward him. She stopped exactly 2 feet from his table. Up close, Alexander noticed the raindrops clinging to her eyelashes and the fierce, uncompromising set of her small jaw.
Why did you bring me here?
She looked at him, looked at him. Her gaze dropped to his hands, noting the faint, jagged scar that slashed across his knuckles, a souvenir from a life he had supposedly left behind. She didn't flinch. "Are you Mr. Thorne?" she asked. Her voice was small, high-pitched, but remarkably steady. It lacked the quavering timidity of most children confronting a stranger, let alone a stranger who regularly made grown men sweat through their tailored suits. Alexander leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. He did not smile. He never offered fake warmth, not even to children. "I am." The little girl gave a firm single nod, as if checking a box on a very important mental clipboard. "My name is Mia. I am 6 3/4. I am here because my mother says it is profoundly rude to leave a person waiting without an explanation."
Stars are calling.
She stumbled slightly over the word, profoundly, but recovered with grace. Alexander's dark eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch.
Don't worry.
"Your mother sent you into Manhattan
I'll be
alone
back
to
for
deliver a
dinner."
message." "Oh no," Mia
You
corrected,
think you
quickly
can
adjusting the straps of her
intimidate
rocket
me?
ship backpack. "She
I
is
know
outside
what
in the
you've
car.
done.
It is parked in a
You're
spot that is
playing a
not a real spot,
dangerous
so she
game.
cannot leave it. She is on the phone.
Maybe,
It is a
but
code red
I'm not
emergency."
bluffing.
"Huts,"
We'll
she
see
said,
about
code red,
that.
with absolute gravity. "She tried to call your telephone,
Mom is
but a
out
lady inside the
there.
machine said
It's
you
an
were
emergency.
unavailable. So Mum told me to
We
run
have
in,
to
find the
get her
scariest looking
inside.
man in the
She
corner,
needs help
and tell
now.
him we are very sorry." A beat of silence passed.
Please, we
At the
can't
nearby
wait.
table, one of
She could
Alexander's
get
hardened
hurt.
security men let out a sound that was half cough, half choke. Alexander shot him a brief, chilling look before returning his attention to the girl. "The scariest looking man?" Alexander repeated, his voice a low rumble. "Yes," Mia said innocently. "Mom said you would be wearing a suit that costs more than our car, and you would be glaring at the door."
You think
"You were
can handle
glaring.
the truth?
I was assessing," he corrected smoothly.
Most people crumble under the weight.
"It looked like glaring," she countered without
But
missing a beat.
you-
For the first time in perhaps 5
You're
years,
different, aren't
Alexander
you?
Thorne felt the corners of his mouth twitch in a genuine, unforced reaction.
You need to
He looked at the girl,
listen to
Mia.
me.
She
No,
was
I
a
don't
tiny,
have
fearless creature
to.
standing in the middle of a predator's den,
This is
completely
serious.
unbothered by the
Stop
teeth bared
arguing.
around her. "What
I'm
is the
not
nature of this code
scared.
red
You're
emergency?"
wrong.
Alexander asked,
You will do
finding
as I
himself
say.
genuinely wanting to know.
I won't.
He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "You may sit, Mia. If your mother is parked illegally, she might be a while." Mia looked at the chair, then at him, evaluating the offer. She climbed into the plush leather seat, her legs dangling far above the floor. She unzipped her rocket ship backpack and pulled out a small, slightly bruised juice box. She offered it toward him. "No, thank you," Alexander said gravely. Mia shrugged, poked the straw into the box, and took a sip. "My mom helps people," she explained, her tone shifting to something deeply serious, mirroring the tone of someone much older. "She works for the city. She protects kids whose real homes are broken. Tonight there was a bad phone call. A boy named Leo needs her right now, and the bad men at her office won't sign the papers to get him out. So she is yelling at them on the phone." Alexander went perfectly still. The amusement vanished, replaced by a cold, sharpened focus. He knew the city's underbelly. He knew the broken systems, the bureaucratic rot, the children who slipped through the cracks because paper pushers didn't care enough to hold on to them. "She is yelling at her bosses?" he asked. Mia nodded enthusiastically. "Yes. She says they are cowards in cheap
This is
suits.
for you.
She used a bad word too, but I am not allowed to
You can
repeat it."
have it.
She paused, her dark eyes locking onto his. "She
Really
cries
good.
sometimes when she thinks I'm asleep. Because it's hard to fight the bad guys all by yourself. The words
Hey,
hit
you want
Alexander
some
with a strange,
juice?
heavy
I
impact.
got extra.
Hard to fight the bad guys all
No.
by yourself.
Thank
He had
you.
built his entire empire on the
Okay,
premise that you
so
fought
I'm
alone,
gonna
you
fight
fought
the
dirty,
bad
and you
guys
made
and
sure you were
save
the biggest monster
everyone.
in the
I'll
room.
be a hero.
But this
I
woman,
see.
Eleanor's good woman, was apparently fighting a system designed to crush her just to pull a child out of the wreckage. And yet, amidst a crisis, she had felt a moral obligation to not leave a stranger waiting in a restaurant. Alexander looked at the clock. It was nearly 8:30. "Mia," he said softly, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a resonance that made his security detail sit up straighter. "Does your mother often fight bad guys?" "Every day," the little girl said proudly. She reached into her backpack again and pulled out a piece of construction paper folded in half. She smoothed it out on the pristine tablecloth. It was a drawing done in vibrant, chaotic crayons. It depicted a woman with wild hair holding a shield standing in front of a smaller figure. "I drew this today. This is my mom. She is a knight." Alexander stared at the crude, colourful drawing. He didn't see wax on paper. He saw the pure, unadulterated faith of a child in her mother's strength. He reached out his large, scarred hand, gently touching the edge of the paper. Before he could speak, a commotion at the front doors drew his attention. A woman burst into the restaurant. She was breathless, her dark raincoat soaked at the shoulders. Her hair, which had likely been neat hours ago, was now falling out of a messy clip in damp tendrils. She wore sensible scuffed heels and a look of absolute, unapologetic panic. She didn't belong in Laura. She didn't carry the arrogant entitlement of the wealthy. She carried the frantic, exhausted energy of a mother who had just realized her child had been out of her sight for too long. Her eyes frantically swept the room, ignoring the disapproving glares of the elite. When her gaze finally landed on the corner booth, on the 6-year-old girl sitting casually across from the most dangerous man in New York, the colour drained entirely from her face. Alexander Thorne leaned back in his chair. He watched the night arrive. Clara Hayes did not walk. She waded. Moving through the dining room of Laura felt like wading through a current of liquid gold and unspoken judgment. Every eye in the room, eyes that belonged to hedge fund managers, socialites, and men who owned politicians, seemed to turn and weigh her in an instant. They saw the damp trench coat, the practical shoes, the exhaustion etched into the fine lines around her eyes. They saw someone who did not belong. Clara didn't care. Her entire universe had tunneled down to the corner booth and the small, bright yellow raincoat sitting there. When she finally reached the table, her breath was coming slightly short, a physical manifestation of the adrenaline spike she'd experienced when she realized Mia wasn't in the car. She stopped at the edge of the mahogany table, her hand instinctively reaching out to rest on the back of Mia's chair. It was a grounding gesture, a silent verification that her daughter was whole, safe, and entirely unbothered. "Mia!" Clara breathed her voice, a mixture of profound relief and maternal reprimand. "Hi, Mom!" Mia said brightly, pausing her assault on the juice box. "I told him we were very sorry. He wasn't glaring, he was assessing." Clara closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, praying for patience, before turning her attention to the man seated across from her daughter. The apologies died in her throat. Clara Hayes spent her days dealing with angry judges, combative parents, and corrupt bureaucrats. She knew how to read power dynamics. But the man sitting in the booth radiated a kind of authority that made the air around him feel thin. He wasn't just wealthy, he was dangerous. It was in the absolute stillness of his posture, the sharp, intelligent cruelty of his dark eyes, and the way the two men at the adjacent table had subtly shifted their weight the moment she approached. "Mr. Thorne," Clara said. She forced her voice to remain steady, refusing to let the intimidation show. She stood tall, her chin lifting slightly. I am Clara Hayes. I cannot apologize enough for my daughter's intrusion nor for my own inexcusable delay. There was an emergency at my office that I could not step away from. It was entirely unprofessional of me to leave you waiting. Alexander studied her. He did not say anything immediately. He watched the way her hand rested protectively near her daughter, the way she held his gaze without the trembling deference he was accustomed to. Eleanor Vance had been right. This was not a plastic socialite. The woman standing before him was running on fumes, battered by a storm he couldn't yet see, but her spine was forged of pure steel. "An emergency?" Alexander repeated, his voice smooth low and devoid of the anger Clara had been bracing for. "A code red, I believe your daughter called it, concerning a boy named Leo." Clara shot a brief, exasperated look at Mia, who gave a helpful nod. "Yes? I am a social worker for the city's child protection services. A placement review fell through the cracks tonight, and a child was at risk. I couldn't leave the phone until I had secured him a safe bed." She said it not as an excuse, but as an undeniable fact of her existence. "I intended to call you, but my phone died the moment I parked outside. Mia was strictly instructed to stay in the locked car while I used the restaurant's lobby phone. Obviously, she interpreted wait as infiltrate. I used my best judgment." Mia defended herself, swinging her legs. "It was an executive decision." To Clara's absolute shock, a dark, rich chuckle escaped the terrifying man's throat. It was a sound that seemed to surprise even him. "Her judgment is surprisingly sound," Alexander said. He gestured to the empty chair beside Mia. "Sit down, Miss Hayes. You look like you're about to collapse, and I make it a rule never to let a woman faint in my presence. It draws unnecessary attention." Clara hesitated. "Mr. Thorne, I really shouldn't. I've ruined your evening, and I look like I've been dragged behind a bus." "You look like a woman who just won a war," Alexander corrected softly. The sincerity in his tone caught her off guard, sending a strange, warm shiver down her spine. "Sit. The chef here is temperamental, and if I leave without ordering, he will take it as a personal insult." Defeated by her own exhaustion and the strange gravity of the man, Clara slipped off her damp coat. One of Alexander's men instantly materialized, taking the coat with a respectful nod and vanishing before Clara could even thank him. She slid into the plush booth beside Mia. A waiter approached immediately, moving with the silent efficiency of a ghost. Alexander didn't look at a menu. "The tasting menu for two. Make sure the Wagyu is medium rare," Alexander instructed. Then he looked at Mia. "And what does the executive decision maker require?" "Do you have chicken nuggets?" Mia asked earnestly. The waiter blinked, his professional facade slipping for a millisecond. I am sure the kitchen can prepare a supreme of chicken lightly breaded." "Nuggets!" Alexander interjected, his voice flat, carrying the weight of an absolute command. "And French fries. Bring ketchup. Not the artisanal reduction, regular ketchup." "Right away, sir," the waiter said, bowing slightly before beating a hasty retreat. Clara watched the exchange with a mixture of horror and amusement. "You just terrorized a Michelin-starred waitstaff for chicken nuggets." "I merely clarified the order," Alexander replied, picking up his glass of Macallan. He took a slow sip, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "You fight for children, Miss Hayes. The least I can do is ensure one gets properly fed." The meal that followed was the most surreal experience of Clara's life. The tension that usually accompanied a blind date was entirely absent, replaced by a strange, quiet truce. They were two people from vastly different universes forced into orbit by a 6-year-old child. Mia dominated the conversation, unbothered by the opulent surroundings. She talked about her school project on the solar system, her profound dislike for green beans, and her belief that her mother was a secret superhero.
She fights the bad guys at the office,
Mia explained, dipping a perfectly fried golden potato baton into a generous puddle of ketchup.
There's a man named Mr. Vance. He's the worst bad guy. He wears too much cologne, and he never signs the papers when Mom asks him to. He's the reason Leo was almost in trouble tonight.
Clara's face flushed.
Mia, sweetheart, we don't discuss office politics at dinner.
She looked at Alexander, embarrassed. I apologize. Richard Vance is my deputy director. We have differing views on urgency when it comes to case files. Alexander's expression did not change, but the temperature in his eyes dropped several degrees. He catalogued the name. Richard Vance.
It sounds like Mr. Vance is an obstacle,
Alexander noted casually.
He's a bureaucrat.
Clara sighed, the fight momentarily draining out of her. She took a sip of the exquisite red wine the sommelier had poured. It tasted like crushed velvet and expensive secrets. He cares more about budget optics than the kids were supposed to be protecting. He's been holding up Leo's transfer for 3 weeks. Tonight, I had to threaten to go to the press just to get him to authorize an emergency bed. She stopped herself, realizing how much she was sharing with a man she had met 20 minutes ago. I'm sorry. You didn't come here to listen to a social worker complain about her boss.
I came here expecting a tedious evening with a stranger who only cared about the balance of my portfolios.
Alexander countered, his voice incredibly low, meant only for her. I am finding this infinitely more engaging. Clara looked up, meeting his gaze. For the first time, she really looked past the dangerous aura, past the expensive suit, and the intimidating stillness. She saw the intelligence in his eyes, the quiet strength, and an unexpected capacity to listen. He wasn't looking at her the way men usually did, either sizing her up or dismissing her as a struggling single mother. He was looking at her like she was something rare. Between the main course and dessert, exhaustion finally claimed Mia. Her head began to nod, her blinks growing longer and heavier, until she slumped sideways, her cheek coming to rest against Clara's arm. Clara immediately stilled. With the practiced ease of a mother, she subtly shifted her body, angling her shoulder to provide a better cushion for the sleeping child. She didn't complain about her arm falling asleep. She just held her. Alexander watched the silent protective adjustment. He had spent his life surrounded by people who demanded to be served, who measured love in transactions and leverage. He had never seen someone offer comfort so freely with such unconscious grace. The restaurant murmured around them, a symphony of clinking crystal and hushed conversations, but at their table, the silence was absolute. She's beautiful, Alexander said quietly, breaking the quiet. Clara smiled, a genuine soft expression that completely transformed her tired face. She reached out with her free hand, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from Mia's forehead.
She's my anchor! She's the reason I keep fighting even when the system makes me want to scream.
The system is broken, Alexander said, his tone carrying a dark, absolute certainty. It is designed to protect those in power, not the vulnerable. Clara looked at him, her curiosity piqued.
You speak like a man who knows a lot about broken systems, Mr. Thorne.
Alexander, he corrected gently. And yes, I know how the machine works, Clara, and I know what it takes to break it. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. He wasn't talking about politics or charity. He was talking about power. Raw, unadulterated power. Before Clara could unpack the weight of his statement, one of Alexander's men stepped out of the shadows, approaching the table with silent urgency. He leaned down, whispering something into Alexander's ear. Clara watched as Alexander's eyes hardened. The gentle listener vanished, replaced instantly by the ruthless predator she had seen when she first walked in. He gave a microscopic nod, and the man retreated.
Is everything all right?
Clara asked, her maternal instincts flaring.
A minor inconvenience,
Alexander said smoothly. He flagged the waiter for the check.
Please let me split it.
Clara began already dreading the number that would be printed on that little black card. Alexander shot her a look that silenced her instantly. It wasn't angry. It was simply unquestionable. He placed a sleek black card in the leather folio without even glancing at the total.
You fought a war today, Clara?
Alexander said, his voice dropping back to that low hypnotic register as he looked at her. Allow me to handle the dinner. Clara didn't argue. She realized that arguing with Alexander Thorne over money was like arguing with a hurricane about the rain. She carefully scooped the sleeping Mia into her arm, standing up. Alexander stood as well. He towered over her, his presence utterly overwhelming. He didn't offer a polite farewell or a promise to call. He simply looked down at her, his dark eyes memorizing the lines of her face, the defiant tilt of her chin, and the fierce protective hold she had on her child.
Get home safe, Clara, he said.
Good night, Alexander, she replied softly. As Clara Hayes walked out of the restaurant carrying her sleeping daughter back out into the rain, she didn't realize that the trajectory of her life had just been violently, irrevocably altered. She didn't know that the man she had just left behind was already dismantling the earth beneath her enemy's feet. Alexander Thorne did not sit back down after Clara and Mia left the table. He stood in the dim, opulent light of Laura, his physical presence still dominating the space, but his mind had already shifted into a cold tactical gear. He turned his gaze toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the heavy rain batter the glass. Silas, the head of his personal security detail, materialized at his elbow. Silas was a man sculpted from the same unforgiving stone as Alexander, quiet, hyperlethal, and entirely devoid of unnecessary emotions.
The minor inconvenience, Silas?
Alexander prompted, his voice barely a murmur above the jazz playing softly in the background.
Clarify?
A dark blue sedan, sir, Silas reported, his eyes also fixed on the street outside. Parked half a block down illegally, directly across from Miss Hayes's vehicle. The driver has a telephoto lens. He was taking pictures of her car and he began snapping rapidly the moment she exited the restaurant with the child. Alexander's jaw tightened. The faint, almost imperceptible shift in his expression would have sent the city's most hardened criminals reaching for their weapons.
Is he police?
No, sir. Private. We ran the plates through our backdoor channels the moment I spotted the lens. Registered to a ghost LLC, the kind used by cheap private investigators to obscure their clients. Through the Rain Street glass, Alexander watched Clara step out into the freezing New York night. She moved with purpose, wrapping her own damp coat securely around the sleeping Mia, entirely oblivious to the camera trained on her from the shadows. She reached a tired 5-year-old compact car that looked painfully out of place among the Bentleys and Maybachs lining the curb. She managed to open the back door, buckle her daughter in with gentle practiced care, and slide into the driver's seat.
She is a social worker,
Alexander stated, his voice dangerously soft.
She fights bureaucrats for the welfare of abused children.
She does not have the kind of money that attracts extortionists, and she does not have the kind of power that requires political surveillance. So who is paying a private investigator to sit in the rain and photograph a struggling mother? I have 2 of our cars on standby, Silas offered quietly.
Put them on her, Alexander commanded. Box the investigator out. If he tries to follow her, force his vehicle down a one-way street or disable his engine. Do it quietly. She is not to know she has an escort, and she is certainly not to know she is being hunted. When she is safely inside her apartment, leave a man on her door. I want a perimeter established. Consider it done." Silas nodded, raising a hand to the earpiece hidden in his collar. Alexander watched as Clara's small car pulled away from the curb. Instantly, the dark blue sedan flashed its headlights, pulling out to follow. But before the investigator could close the distance, two massive unmarked black SUVs slid seamlessly out of an underground garage, pulling into the lane and forming an impenetrable steel wall between Clara's car and her pursuer. It was a beautiful, terrifying ballet of vehicular dominance. Clara's taillights faded into the rainy distance, perfectly safe, entirely oblivious to the angels of death guarding her bumper. "Now!" Alexander said, turning away from the window, the sudden drop in his vocal temperature freezing the air around him. "I want everything. I want the history of Clara Hayes. I want her financial records, her employment history, her phone logs. I want to know who broke her heart, who left her fighting alone, and what she eats for breakfast. And more importantly, I want a complete invasive dissection of a man named Richard Vance at the Department of Child Protection Services. Tear his life apart down to the studs." Within 2 hours, Alexander was sitting behind the massive slab of petrified wood that served as the desk in his penthouse office. The city stretched out below him like a glittering carpet of diamonds and broken glass. The room was silent save for the rhythmic ticking of a vintage clock and the soft rustle of high-grade paper. Silas had delivered the dossier in record time. Alexander's intelligence network was faster and more thorough than any government agency fueled by unlimited capital and a complete disregard for privacy laws. Alexander opened the file on Clara first. He read the clinical data, but his mind painted the agonizing human story beneath the ink. Clara Hayes, 32 years old, born to working-class parents who had passed away when she was in college. She had married young a man named David Mercer, an ambitious, smooth-talking investment banker. 5 years ago, when Clara was 6 months pregnant with Mia, Mercer had emptied their joint accounts, liquidated their assets, and vanished to South America with a 22-year-old heiress. He had left Clara with a stack of mounting debts, an impending eviction notice, and a child on the way. Alexander's finger traced the edge of the paper. Most people would have shattered. They would have drowned in bitterness or turned to a life of hollow desperation. Clara hadn't. She had worked night shifts at a hospital intake desk to keep a roof over her head while finishing her degree. She had given birth to Mia alone in a public ward. She had clawed her way up, taking a grueling, underpaid job as a social worker, because having been abandoned herself, she refused to let vulnerable children feel that same bottomless drop. He flipped to her financial records. It was a bleak landscape of carefully managed poverty, late notices on her electricity bill, a credit card maxed out entirely on groceries, and pediatric dental bills. Her bank account currently held a balance that Alexander would tip a valet on a Tuesday. Yet despite this crushing weight, she had walked into Laura, offered to pay for a $1,000 dinner, and held her head up like a queen. She fights the bad guys all by herself. Mia's voice echoed in his mind. Alexander exhaled slowly. He closed Clara's file, feeling a strange, tight sensation in his chest, a feeling of profound, violent protectiveness that he had never extended to anyone outside his immediate inner circle. He reached for the second file. Richard Vance, Deputy Director, Child Protection Services. If Clara's file was a testament to human resilience, Vance's file was a monument to bureaucratic rot. Alexander's eyes scanned the pages, his analytical mind quickly connecting the dots that Clara, constrained by rules and lack of resources, couldn't see. Vance lived well beyond the means of a civil servant. He had a luxury condo in Tribeca, a mistress in Chelsea, and a penchant for high-stakes underground poker. The math didn't align until Alexander reached the section detailing the city's foster care contracting. It was a classic, disgusting kickback scheme.
Vance was deliberately delaying the transfer of children, like little Leo, to state-funded safe environments. Instead, he was funneling them into overcrowded, privately owned emergency shelters. The owners of those private shelters were billing the city exorbitant daily rates for crisis care. And in return, a percentage of those profits was quietly being funneled into an offshore account controlled by Richard Vance. Clara was a threat. She was a dedicated, relentless hound who actually read the files, who actually cared about the children, and who pushed for immediate permanent placements. By doing her job perfectly, she was cutting into Vance's illicit profit margins. Alexander picked up the photograph that had been sent from Silas's team, the image of the private investigator outside the restaurant. Vance hired him. Alexander realized the truth, clicking into place with cold precision. Vance knew Clara was threatening to go to the press about Leo's delayed placement. Vance had hired a cheap private eye to dig up dirt on her to find a reason to fire her, discredit her, or blackmail her into silence. The investigator was probably hoping to catch her meeting with a journalist at the restaurant, or perhaps hoping to frame her as an unfit mother for bringing a child to a late-night dinner. They were trying to destroy a woman whose only crime was caring too much. They were trying to take away the meager livelihood of a mother who was already holding her world together with duct tape and sheer willpower. Alexander stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He walked over to the massive window looking down at the sleeping city. He was not a good man. He had never pretended to be. He had crushed rivals, dismantled corporations, and built his empire on the bones of those who had thought themselves apex predators. He was the monster that other monsters checked under their beds for. But there were rules in the dark. You did not touch children, and you did not prey on a mother who was standing between a child and the abyss. He walked back to his desk. Sitting precisely in the center of the mahogany surface, completely out of place among the dossiers and encrypted phones, was the folded piece of construction paper. He picked it up. He opened it, looking at the wild, colorful crayon drawing of the woman holding a shield. The knight. "Silas?" Alexander said, pressing the intercom button on his desk. "Sir!" Silas's voice crackled immediately through the speaker. "Are Miss Hayes and the child secure?" "Yes, sir. They arrived at her apartment in Queens 40 minutes ago. Our men are stationed at the front and rear entrances." The private investigator was permanently discouraged from following them. His camera was confiscated and crushed. He will not be returning. "Good," Alexander said, his voice dropping into a deadly absolute calm, the kind of calm that preceded an earthquake. "Recall the day shift team. Wake up the acquisitions department, the legal hounds, and the asset liquidation crew. Tell them to clear their schedules for the next 24 hours. "Target, sir?" Silas asked, sensing the blood in the water. Alexander stared at the name on the second file. He felt the cold, familiar thrill of an impending execution. But this time, it wasn't about business. It was deeply, irrevocably personal. "Richard Vance," Alexander said softly. "I want his career erased. I want his financial accounts drained. I want his offshore kickbacks exposed to the federal authorities with a bow on top. By the time the sun sets tomorrow, I want that man begging for a job, scrubbing toilets, and I want him to have absolutely no idea what hit him." Alexander paused, his finger gently tracing the crayon shield on the drawing. "No one target, sir," Alexander murmured to the empty room. No one." The silent execution. Clara arrives at work, dreading the fallout from her defiance, expecting to be fired by her corrupt boss, Richard Vance. Instead, she witnesses the sudden, brutal, and absolute destruction of Vance's life and career, as Alexander's invisible trap springs shut, securing the safety of the child she was fighting for. Target word count 1,400 words. The morning light filtering into Clara's small Queen's apartment was grey and unforgiving. At 6:00 a.m, the alarm clock buzzed a harsh mechanical sound that signalled the start of another grueling day. Clara silenced it with a heavy hand, staring up at the water-stained ceiling for a long moment. Her body ached with a bone-deep exhaustion, but her mind was already racing. Today was going to be bad. Yesterday she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She had threatened Richard Vance with media exposure if he didn't sign the emergency placement forms for little Leo. It was a desperate career suicide bluff, and she knew Vance wouldn't let it slide. He was a man who punished insubordination with a vindictive joy. She fully expected to walk into the office today and find a termination notice on her desk. If I lose this job, how do I pay the rent? The thought was a familiar, suffocating weight on her chest. She turned her head looking at Mia, who was still fast asleep in the twin bed across the room, the rocket ship backpack resting on the floor nearby. The memory of last night washed over Clara, the opulence of Laura, the terrifying stillness of Alexander Thorne, and the strange, quiet comfort she had felt sitting across from him. It felt like a fever dream. Men like Alexander Thorne did not belong in her world. They were apex predators who lived in glass towers while she fought in the muddy trenches of the city's broken systems. She forced herself out of bed. She made oatmeal, packed Mia's lunch, and braided her daughter's hair with practiced efficiency. "Mom," Mia mumbled through a mouthful of cereal.
"Do you think the scary man ate all his chicken nuggets?"
Clara couldn't help but smile, a genuine tired curve of her lips.
"I think Mr. Thorne probably had his own dinner bug."
"He was nice,"
Mia decided firmly.
"He listened."
Clara kissed the top of Mia's head.
"He did. Now grab your coat. We're going to be late."
By 8:30 a.m, Clara had dropped Mia off at school and was swiping her ID badge at the entrance of the Department of Child Protection Services in downtown Manhattan. The contrast between this place and the restaurant from the night before was jarring. Here, the fluorescent lights flickered, casting a sickly pallor over the rows of grey cubicles. The air smelled of stale coffee anxiety and cheap printer ink. Clara walked to her desk, her stomach tying itself into tight, painful knots. She didn't even take off her coat before waking up her computer monitor. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, bringing up the internal database. Case file Leo Jenkins. Status pending Deputy Director. Approval. Her heart sank. Vance hadn't signed it. Leo was still sitting in a temporary, overcrowded holding facility, waiting for a bed in a therapeutic foster home that had already been approved by everyone except the man at the top. "Hayes!" A sharp voice barked across the bullpen. Clara flinched. She looked up to see Richard Vance standing in the doorway of his glass-walled office. Vance was a man in his late 40s who spent too much money on tailored suits to hide his expanding waistline and entirely too much on a cologne that smelled like artificial pine and arrogance. His smile was thin, predatory, and entirely devoid of warmth. "My office now," Vance commanded. The bullpen went dead silent. The other social workers instinctively lowered their heads, pretending to be engrossed in their paperwork. They knew what that tone meant. It was the tone of an executioner calling the next name. Clara took a slow, steadying breath. She straightened her spine, pulling her shoulders back. She was terrified, but she would not let him see her bleed. She walked across the worn carpet and stepped into Vance's office. Vance closed the door behind her, ensuring the blinds were drawn. He walked around his large, cluttered desk and leaned against it, crossing his arms.
"You look tired, Clara,"
Vance began, his voice dripping with condescension.
"Rough night, or just the stress of knowing you finally pushed too far. Did you sign Leo's placement file, Richard?"
Clara asked, her voice calm, refusing to take the bait. Vance laughed a short, ugly sound.
"You're in no position to make demands, Clara. Not after yesterday's little tantrum. Threatening to go to the press. You think a single mother with a mountain of debt has the leverage to take on the department? I could have your license revoked by lunch. Clara stood her ground, her fingernails digging into the palms of her hands. The placement is legal. It's vetted, and the child is in danger. By withholding your signature, you are violating departmental protocol. If you fire me, I will make sure the union and the Inspector General know exactly why. Vance's eyes narrowed, his smugness replaced by a flash of genuine venom. You really think you're untouchable? I know more about you than you think, Clara. I know you were at a fancy restaurant late last night with your kid hobnobbing with people way above your pay grade, instead of answering your phone. A mother who drags her kid to a high-end bar at 9 o'clock at night. Well, that sounds like a mother whose fitness could be questioned by family court, doesn't it? The blood froze in Clara's veins. It was a thinly veiled, monstrous threat. He was threatening to take Mia. The sheer malice of it took her breath away.
You wouldn't dare!
She whispered, her voice shaking with sudden, violent rage. I am the deputy director, Vance sneered, stepping closer. I can do whatever I... At exactly 9:02 a.m., the invisible guillotine fell. The heavy glass door of Vance's office didn't just open. It was shoved inward with enough force to crack the hinge. Clara jumped startled. 3 men stepped into the office. 2 were wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the FBI emblazoned across the back. The third man walking point wore a sharp conservative suit and carried a thick black leather briefcase. He had the unmistakable aura of a federal prosecutor. Behind them, the bullpen had erupted into chaotic whispers. Several uniformed police officers were already moving through the floor, securing filing cabinets and blocking the elevators. Vance's face went completely white. The arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by the slack-jawed panic of a man who suddenly realizes he is not the apex predator.
What is the meaning of this?
Vance demanded, his voice cracking, losing an octave.
I am a city official. You can't just barge into my office.
The prosecutor did not blink. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents thick enough to choke a horse. Richard Vance, the prosecutor said, his voice carrying the dry, unfeeling weight of a sledgehammer. I am Special Agent Miller, Federal Bureau of Investigation Public Corruption Unit. We are executing a federal search warrant on this premises, your electronic devices, and your personal residence in Tribeca. Furthermore, you are under arrest.
Arrest!
Vance gasped, stumbling backward until he hit his desk.
On what charges?
Wire fraud, extortion, conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States government, and 17 counts of accepting illegal kickbacks related to city foster care contracting, Miller recited flawlessly. Your offshore accounts in the Caymans have been frozen as of 8:45 a.m. this morning. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Clara stood frozen against the wall, her mind entirely unable to process the absolute speed and brutality of what she was witnessing. Less than 60 seconds ago, this man had threatened to destroy her family. Now he was being dismantled, piece by piece.
This is a mistake,
Vance shrieked, as one of the agents grabbed his wrist, twisting it behind his back with practiced, unforgiving force. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed sharply in the small office. I want my lawyer. You have no proof. We received a completely encrypted, unredacted data dump at 3 o'clock this morning, Mr. Vance, Miller replied coolly, stepping aside as the agents shoved Vance toward the door. It included your bank routing numbers, the IP addresses of your hidden servers, and audio recordings of your conversations with private contractors. It was the most comprehensive, devastatingly thorough whistleblower package I've seen in 20 years. Your lawyer won't be fighting to keep you out of prison. He'll be fighting to keep you out of a maximum security federal facility. Vance looked at Clara as he was dragged past her, his eyes were wild and terrified. He looked like a man who had just been hit by a train he never saw coming. Then he was gone. The office was a whirlwind of federal agents seizing hard drives and boxing up files. Clara slowly backed out of the office, her legs feeling like lead. She walked back to her desk and collapsed into her chair. The entire bullpen was in a state of shock. An unredacted data dump at 3 o'clock in the morning. Clara stared blankly at her computer screen. She reached out with a trembling hand and refreshed the internal database. The screen blinked. The red pending deputy director approval flag next to Leo Jenkins' name vanished. In its place, a bright green notification appeared. Status approved. Immediate transfer authorized by the Office of the Commissioner. Transport dispatched. A tear slipped down Clara's cheek, hot and sudden.
Leo was safe. He was getting out.
She leaned back in her chair, the adrenaline slowly draining from her system, leaving her dizzy. Who had done this? The FBI didn't just stumble upon offshore accounts overnight. Someone with immense resources, terrifying reach, and an absolute lack of hesitation had orchestrated this. Someone had taken a sledgehammer to the corrupt foundation of Richard Vance's life, timing it perfectly to save her before the axe could fall. A memory flashed in her mind. Dark eyes, a custom-forged watch, and a voice that sounded like gravel and silk. I know how the machine works, Clara, and I know what it takes to break it. Alexander Thorne. He hadn't just paid for her dinner. He had seen the war she was fighting, recognized the monster trying to destroy her, and he had simply erased him in silence, without demanding praise, without leaving a trace, and without asking for anything in return. Clara looked out the small, dirty window of the CPS office toward the towering glass skyscrapers of Manhattan. For the first time in her life, the crushing weight of being entirely alone in the world felt lighter. Somewhere in that glittering skyline, a dragon had just burned down her enemy's castle. And Clara Hayes finally understood exactly how dangerous her blind date really was. The rest of the day at the Department of Child Protection Services passed in a surreal, muted haze. The absence of Richard Vance was a physical weight lifted off the entire floor. Agents from the Inspector General's office had taken over Vance's desk, methodically archiving the breadth of his corruption. But Clara didn't care about the federal investigation or the news vans that had started gathering on the sidewalk below. She only cared about the facts that had come through at 11:15 a.m. It was a confirmation from the St. Jude Therapeutic Home in Brooklyn. Little Leo had arrived safely. He was eating a hot lunch, he had his own bed, and he was finally permanently out of the system's purgatory. Clara sat at her desk, her hands resting flat against the cool laminate surface. The office around her was buzzing with frantic gossip. Her co-workers were huddled in small groups, whispering wildly about how the FBI had managed to build such an airtight case overnight. An unredacted data dump at 3 o'clock in the morning, Clara knew. She knew with the kind of absolute bone-deep certainty that defies logic. She turned to her computer and opened a blank browser tab. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a second before she typed in a single name, Alexander Thorne. The search engine yielded exactly what she had expected, and yet it was entirely overwhelming. There were no social media profiles, no candid photos, no interviews. There were only sleek, intimidating articles from the Wall Street Journal. And Forbes. He was the CEO of Thorne Industries, a labyrinthine holding company with tendrils in global shipping, high-end Manhattan real estate, and private security. The articles described him with words that sent a shiver down her spine. Ruthless and apex predator of the boardroom, a ghost who moves markets with a whisper.
There were also darker, unverified blogs, hinting at his control over the city's underground economy, a man who possessed the kind of power that mayors and governors deferred to.
He was a kingmaker, a destroyer.
And last night, she had eaten French fries with him, while her 6-year-old daughter chatted about school projects. Clara looked down at her hands. They were trembling just slightly. Most women would have been terrified to realize they had caught the attention of a man so deeply immersed in the shadows. But as Clara thought about the suffocating dread she had woken up with that morning, and the miraculous absolute safety she felt now she didn't feel fear, she felt an overwhelming, profound sense of gratitude and a burning need to see him. At 4:00 p.m., Clara gathered her things. She left the office, stepping out into the crisp, biting chill of the New York afternoon. She didn't go to the subway to head back to Queens. Instead, she hailed a yellow cab, giving the driver the address of the Thorne Industries Tower in the financial district. 20 minutes later, Clara stood on the pavement, tipping her head back to look at the monolith of black glass and steel that scraped the grey sky. It looked like a fortress. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed the wrinkles out of her practical navy trench coat, adjusted the strap of her worn leather tote bag, and walked through the revolving doors. The lobby was a cavern of polished black marble and brushed steel. Security was visible, and formidable men in dark suits with earpieces stationed at strategic points. Clara walked up to the sprawling obsidian reception desk. The woman behind it looked like a supermodel dressed in flawless designer couture.
"May I help you?"
The receptionist asked, her tone polite, but laced with the subtle practiced dismissal reserved for people who clearly did not belong in the building.
"I am here to see Alexander Thorne,"
Clara said, her voice remarkably steady. "My name is Clara Hayes." The receptionist offered a tight, patronizing smile.
"I'm afraid Mr. Thorne does not take unannounced meetings, Miss Hayes. His schedule is managed months in advance. If you'd like to leave a message, Miss Hayes is expected."
The voice came from behind Clara. She turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man with a military bearing stepping out of a private elevator bank. She recognized him instantly. He was the man who had been sitting 2 tables away at Laura, the one who had taken her coat. The receptionist's eyes widened in sheer panic, her patronizing smile vanishing instantly.
"Mr. Vance Silas! I apologize. I didn't see it on the schedule."
"You wouldn't have," Silas said smoothly, his eyes never leaving Clara. His demeanor was entirely respectful, lacking any of the menace he had radiated the night before.
Miss Hayes, if you will follow me, the boss is waiting.
Clara swallowed hard and followed Silas past the security turnstiles, stepping into a private elevator lined with dark mahogany. Silas pressed his thumb against a biometric scanner, and the elevator shot upward with stomach-dropping speed.
"Did he know I was coming?"
Clara asked quietly, watching the floor numbers blur past on the digital display. Silas gave a rare, microscopic smile. "Mr. Thorne knows everything that happens in his city, Miss Hayes. He was notified the moment your cab pulled onto Wall Street." The elevator chimed the doors sliding open to reveal the penthouse floor. It was breathtakingly silent. Silas led her down a wide corridor lined with modern art, finally stopping in front of a pair of massive soundproof double doors. He opened one and gestured for her to enter. Clara stepped inside. The office was vast, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying, godlike view of Manhattan. The decor was minimalist, cold, and immensely expensive. But her eyes were immediately drawn to the man standing by the glass, looking out over the empire he ruled. Alexander turned as the door clicked shut behind her. He had discarded his suit jacket, wearing only a tailored black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the dark, intricate ink that wound around his wrists. In the daylight, he looked even more striking. The harsh lines of his face softened slightly by the golden hour sun filtering through the glass. He didn't speak, He just watched her, his dark eyes cataloguing her presence in his sanctuary. Clara walked forward, stopping a few feet from his massive petrified wood desk. She looked down and her breath hitched in her throat. Sitting in the exact center of his pristine, meticulously organized desk, completely out of place among the encrypted phones and high-level corporate dossiers, was Mia's crayon drawing. The knight with the shield!
You kept it?
Clara whispered the sight of that fragile piece of paper, dismantling the last of her defenses. It is a very accurate portrait, Alexander replied, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the quiet room. He walked slowly toward the desk, closing the distance between them. Clara looked up, meeting his terrifying, beautiful gaze. Richard Vance was arrested by the FBI this morning. They raided his office and froze his offshore accounts. Someone sent them a completely unredacted, decrypted data dump in the middle of the night. Alexander's expression remained perfectly unreadable. It sounds like a corrupt man finally met the consequences of his actions. The city is safer for it.
He was going to fire me,
Clara said, her voice shaking with the sheer emotional weight of the day.
Worse than that, he threatened to take Mia from me.
He hired a private investigator to follow us from the restaurant last night. Build a case against my fitness as a mother. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Clara saw the monster the articles had warned about. A terrifying, lethal darkness flared in Alexander's eyes. A silent promise of violence that made the air heavy. The investigator has been dealt with, Alexander said softly, his tone making it very clear the man would never hold a camera again. He will not approach you or your daughter ever again, and Mr. Vance will spend the next 2 decades in a federal cage where his wealth cannot protect him. Clara stared at him.
Why?
She asked, a tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down her cheek.
I am a stranger. I am nobody.
Men like you do not burn down government officials for a woman you met an hour late for a blind date. Alexander closed the remaining distance between them. He stood so close she could smell the scent of aged cedar and rain on his clothes. He raised a hand, his scarred knuckles brushing against her cheek, with shocking gentleness wiping away the tear.
You are not nobody, Clara,
he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, aching whisper.
I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who bleed the world dry for $1.
And then a 6-year-old girl walked into my perimeter and told me that her mother cries in the dark because she is trying to fight the bad guys all by herself. Clara's breath hitched, her eyes locked onto his.
I am not a good man,
Alexander confessed, his thumb lightly tracing her jawline.
I operate in the dark. I break things, but last night I watched a woman who has nothing, who has been abandoned and broken by this city, offer to pay for my dinner with her last dime, just to keep her dignity.
I watched you protect your child. I watched you fight a war for a boy who wasn't even yours. He stepped closer, his physical presence entirely enveloping her, creating a wall of absolute, impenetrable safety.
You should not have to fight alone, Clara,
he murmured, his eyes blazing with a fierce, possessive heat.
Not today. Not tomorrow. Never again.
Clara looked up at the most dangerous man in New York. A man who could destroy lives with a phone call, and realized she had never felt safer in her entire life. She didn't pull away from his touch. Instead, she leaned into it, letting out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 5 years.
Thank you,
she whispered. Alexander's hand moved to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling lightly in her dark hair. You never have to thank me for protecting what is mine. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute, sealing a promise that neither of them would ever break. Ciao bandaichin, la juana kakchong ta gatai dankwa kom sukwa tuan bo kauchuyen. Chongkoi kong nai sik hep laihan trin de trak drukwa Clara bang mot gai ket vo kung non got no lang man vakuen luktung chuan motif. Billionaire, CEO, protective romance. Doi de la chuang 6 sin kiet ta ko chong ta. Byok 3.1 da ni chi tit chong koi. Chapter 6, A Crown Worn Immediately. Muktu 1100 to Asteris noidong hai, tuan sauki vans bi bat kwok song kua. Clara da buoch sang mod trang moi tui sang hon. Alexander moi hai me kon den din thuren ka ano ngo I o. Dai da mia dodwok tang mot mon kwa dag biet mot chungwa that. Alexander mo long voi Clara go bo huan tuan lop vo bok dan han de thin ko bok vo ko kluan me mahe. Mot no hon tu yet dep dans do su ko da kwa mot ya din thuksu. Byoki 3.2 and 3.3 and 3.4. Din han viet kichban chong 6. Main point chapter 6. A crown worn immediately. The aftermath of the crisis brings peace to Clara's life. Alexander invites Clara and Mia to his private estate, proving his devotion goes far beyond mere protection. The final romantic payoff, and the forging of a new family. Target word count 1150 words. 2 weeks passed. In the ruthless, fast-paced machinery of New York City, a fortnight was enough time for empires to fall and new ones to rise. The fallout from Richard Vance's sudden and brutal arrest had sent absolute shockwaves through the city's political infrastructure. The media had a field day with the unsealed federal indictments detailing the depth of his offshore kickbacks and the sheer cruelty of his negligence. But inside the Department of Child Protection Services, the atmosphere was entirely different. It felt as though a heavy, suffocating window had finally been thrown open, letting in fresh air for the first time in years. With Vance gone, the bottleneck of delayed placements vanished overnight. Clara had been called into the commissioner's office expecting an interrogation. Instead, she was met with apologies and a promotion. The federal agents had noted her relentless documented efforts to bypass Vance's corruption to save children like Leo. She was appointed as the interim director of her division, given the authority and the budget to actually fix the broken system she had been fighting for so long. Her life had stabilized. The crushing, paralyzing anxiety over bills and targeted harassment had evaporated. But amidst the triumph and the sudden peace, Clara found her mind constantly drifting back to the man in the glass tower. Alexander Thorne had not contacted her since that afternoon in his office. He had dismantled her nightmares, wrapped her in a blanket of absolute safety, and then stepped back into the shadows, demanding absolutely nothing in return. It drove Clara crazy. She missed him. She missed the terrifying stillness of his presence, the deep rumble of his voice, and the bizarre, profound connection they had forged over a plate of chicken nuggets. On a bright, crisp Saturday morning, the waiting finally ended. Clara and Mia were in their queen's apartment eating pancakes when a sharp knock echoed at the door. Clara opened it to find Silas standing in the hallway, looking completely out of place in the modest, slightly run-down corridor. He was holding a thick cream-coloured envelope. "Good morning, Miss Hayes." "Miss Mia," Silas said, offering a respectful nod. "Mr. Thorne sends his regards. He respectfully requests your company for the afternoon if your schedule permits." Clara took the envelope with a trembling hand. Inside was a heavy cardstock note written in sharp, elegant handwriting. "Bring the executive decision maker. There is someone I want her to meet." "A car is waiting downstairs." An hour later, Clara and Mia were seated in the back of a sprawling black Maybach, gliding smoothly out of the concrete jungle of the city and heading north. They drove for nearly 2 hours, the scenery shifting from towering skyscrapers to lush rolling hills and dense forests painted in the vibrant golds and crimsons of early autumn. The car finally turned down a private tree-lined driveway, the iron gates parting silently to grant them access to a world Clara had only seen in movies. Alexander's private estate, was breathtaking. It was a massive stone-built manor that looked like it had been transported piece by piece from the European countryside, surrounded by manicured lawns, pristine gardens, and acres of private woodland. As the car pulled up to the circular driveway, Alexander was waiting on the front steps. Clara's breath hitched. He wasn't wearing his customary armor-like business suit. Today he wore dark denim heavy boots and a charcoal cashmere sweater that molded perfectly to his broad shoulders. Without the severe trappings of the boardroom, the raw masculine beauty of him was almost overwhelming. The moment the car stopped, Mia unbuckled her seatbelt and threw the door open. "Mr. Thorne!" she yelled, running up the stone steps without a single ounce of hesitation. Alexander crouched down, catching the 6-year-old with effortless strength. A rare, genuine smile broke across his face, transforming his harsh features into something staggeringly warm. "Hello, Mia. I see you brought your mother." "I did," Mia confirmed, adjusting her rocket ship backpack. "You live in a castle. Are there dragons here?" "No dragons," Alexander promised, standing up and taking Mia's small hand in his large, scarred one. "But there is something else." "Let's go see." Clara stepped out of the car, her eyes locking onto Alexander's. The heat in his gaze was immediate and undeniable, sending a sudden flush across her skin. "You didn't have to send Silas," Clara said softly as she walked up the steps to join them. "A text message would have sufficed." "You are not a woman who deserves a text message, Clara," Alexander replied smoothly, his eyes dropping briefly to her lips before meeting her gaze again. "Come, walk with me." He led them around the side of the manor down a cobblestone path that opened up to a sprawling, pristine stable complex. The smell of fresh hay and polished leather filled the air. A stable master was waiting near a fenced paddock, and standing in the centre of the lush green grass was a pony. It was a beautiful, sturdy little horse with a coat the colour of toasted caramel and a dark, flowing mane. Mia stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes going as wide as saucers. She let go of Alexander's hand, walking slowly toward the wooden fence, as if afraid the vision would vanish if she moved too fast. Is that for me?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling with a level of awe that shattered Clara's heart in the best possible way. "His name is Barnaby," Alexander said, resting his arms on the top rail of the fence beside the little girl. "He is extremely gentle. He loves apples, and he is entirely yours. You can come visit and ride him whenever you want." Mia didn't scream or jump. She just pressed her face against the wooden rail, tears of pure, unadulterated joy pooling in her dark eyes. "I brought apples in my backpack," she murmured, already unzipping it. The stable master gently guided Mia inside the paddock to introduce her to Barnaby, leaving Clara and Alexander standing alone by the fence. Clara turned to him, her emotions a chaotic, beautiful mess. "Alexander, this is too much. You gave her a horse." "I have more money than God, Clara." "A pony is a fraction of a rounding error," he said dismissively, though his eyes were completely focused on her. "What matters is the look on her face. What matters is that she gets to be a child, and you get to stop carrying the weight of the entire world on your shoulders." "I don't know how to repay you," Clara admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "For Vance, for Willio, for this. I don't belong in this world, Alexander." Alexander turned to her, his expression suddenly intensely serious. He reached out his hands, gently framing her face. His thumbs brushed lightly across her cheekbones, his touch carrying a reverence that made Clara's knees feel weak. "You belong wherever I am," Alexander stated, his voice a low, possessive rumble that left no room for argument. "For years I built an empire because I thought power was the only thing that could keep the darkness away.
But it was empty, Clara. It was a fortress with no one inside. He stepped closer, closing the space between them, until Clara had to tilt her head back to look into his eyes. Then a brave little girl walked into my life and showed me a drawing of a knight. And then I met the knight, Alexander whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips. I don't want to just be the man who clears your path, Clara. I want to be the man who walks it with you. I want to wake up next to you. I want to build a life where you never have to be afraid again. Clara looked into the eyes of the city's most feared predator and saw only absolute, unwavering devotion. The walls she had built around her heart for 5 long years didn't just crumble. They turned to dust. She reached up her hands, sliding over his broad shoulders, tangling her fingers into the soft hair at the nape of his neck. I'm not afraid anymore, Clara whispered. Alexander groaned softly, a sound of profound surrender, and brought his mouth down onto hers. The kiss was consuming. It was not polite or hesitant. It possessed the fierce, desperate heat of a man who had finally found the one thing he didn't know he was starving for. Clara responded with equal fire, pouring all her gratitude, her exhaustion, and her newly discovered love into the embrace. He kissed her like she was the center of his gravity, his large hands pulling her flush against his solid chest, anchoring her against the storm of the world. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing heavily, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. Move in with me, he murmured against her lips. Bring Mia. Let me take care of you. Both of you. Clara looked over at the paddock. Mia was giggling, feeding an apple slice to the caramel-coloured pony, looking happier and more carefree than she ever had in her entire life. Then Clara looked back at Alexander, the man who had burned down her enemies, and handed her a kingdom. In Mia's drawing, the horse had won a prize and decided not to wait for a special occasion. He wears it right away. Some things were too precious, too incredibly rare to wait for. Clara smiled, a radiant, breathtaking expression that Alexander knew he would spend the rest of his life protecting. Yes, she said, we'll wear the crown right away. The worst blind date of Clara Hayes' life had ended an hour late, but it had brought her exactly where she was always meant to be.